So good morning. I'm Dr. Wendy Howard from UCF's Pegasus Innovation Lab, and we are honored to host the inaugural Florida Online Innovation Summit. For those of you who were here for the previous 2 days for the Top Kit workshop, thank you for coming back. I have just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we officially kick off the event. For those of you who have been here for the last 2 days, you may have noticed it's a little tighter in here. We exceeded our capacity, wow, for our first event, so we had to bring in a couple extra tables. So we reconfigured a little bit, and I just want to draw your attention to the tape on the floor. There are a couple of little bumps, so please be careful, be aware that they're there so that you don't trip. But we wanted to make sure we sent power to your tables so that you can keep your devices charged throughout the day. So watch those taped down wires on the floor there. Also, outside this door across the hall is the restrooms. And directly in the middle of the hall is breakfast. I think most of you have found that already. So we'll have breakfast and lunch served out in the hall, and you can bring it in here. We'll continue to have drinks available in the room as well as out in the hallway, so you can go back and fix yourself a second cup of coffee midway if you need to without leaving the room. Let's see. Also, we purposely left the lunch open on our agenda, so there's no formal presentation during lunch. We hope that you'll use that time to network with each other. We rarely get to bring everyone together from across the state of Florida, so I hope you take advantage of that opportunity to get to know the people in the room and spend some time at lunch networking. So to officially kick things off, it is my distinct honor to introduce our interim president, also Vice President of Partnerships and Chief Innovation Officer, Thad Seymour. Thank you for kicking off our event.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to sunny Orlando. I know in your parts of the state it's not perfect weather all the time. It is here. Every single day looks just like this. So I'm thrilled to welcome you here to UCF. We are so excited about the topic you all are working on and that you spend your careers focused on. And I know that this kind of exchange is a phenomenal way for us all to get better at this really important field. And so we're thrilled to be able to host this. And you all know, you're on and have been on the cutting edge of an arena that is really transforming education in general, but particularly higher education. And you know, we've been at this at UCF for over 20 years, as many of you have. We started with a few hundred students in 1996. We now have over 500,000 credit hours online, and we're learning every single day, as you are. And so this kind of exchange is a chance for us to all broaden our learning and our best practices and share those. So I know and I encourage you to do all of that. We talk a lot at UCF about this idea of, you know, how should we as a research university in the center of a large growing state, how should we be judged? I think this applies to all universities. And we talk a lot about impact. And we do that because as we think about our role and how we change our region and our state and beyond, it is, and our strategic plan embraces this idea, it's the combination or the multiplicative relationship between scale and excellence. This idea that if you're going to touch as many lives as possible and transform a region or a state or a nation or a world, you have to have both of those things, and that is how you multiply what you're doing. For us to do that to the point that we are today, but more importantly as we look forward, it is what you all do every day that allows universities like us and yours and others who will follow to really amplify that impact. But it is that combination of scale and excellence that matters. So doing all of this in a mediocre way doesn't have the kind of impact that we're all focused on and talking about. And so I have a weird background as an academic originally, and then I spent a lot of time in the technology field. I joined a software company in the late 80s, which at the time was $300 million in revenue, which made it one of the top 10 technology companies in the world, so software companies in the world. You know, you have companies that do that now before lunch. And so that's a measure of how our world has changed, and as we all know, that's not slowing down. And so this intersection of technology and learning is critical. So I'm excited about the work you're going to do. Since I get the microphone, I get to brag a little bit about the work we've done. We have a great team, Tom Cavanaugh, you all know, and so many others here who have really committed a big part of their careers to how do we get better at this. And that's an ongoing quest. We were this year ranked as the 10th most innovative university in the country, which is an honor. We've been further down that list, and I believe a whole lot of that is because of the work we've been doing in this arena, because I think others recognize how important this kind of work is. So we're excited about where we're headed with this. We're also excited about learning from all of you, as well as sharing what we've learned in this arena. So my job is to welcome you, to thank you for what you're working on, and also to introduce a guy who has lived in this world and is one of the great thinkers and doers in the world that we all care about. So I'm going to invite Lou Pugliese, right? I get that right? Yeah, it was a shot at it, but. Lou has an incredible background. He serves as a Senior Innovation Fellow and Managing Director of EdPlus at Arizona State, which, as you know, they've been a real leader in this arena as well. His entire 25-year career has really been at the intersection of learning, enterprise learning software, the role of psychometrics and data science in that arena. He's a former CEO of Blackboard and Director of Strategy at ETS. And has a ton of experience developing a wide variety of enterprise technology solutions in the learning and teaching space. So he's doing great things, driving innovation at ASU, and we're thrilled to have him here to share his vision for this important field. Lou?
Thanks very much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming. It was a pretty good attempt at the last name. I have to say it the right way. It's an Italian last name, and if I don't say it the right way, I will get written out of the will. So I don't actually know if there's any money in the will, but we'll find out someday. So, okay, I think we're good to go. Oh, you've got it. Great, right. Okay, so how many people do we have that are actually teaching faculty right now? Raise your hand. Got it. Okay, and how many in the general technology arena, either authoring technology or working with some sort of technology products or services? Okay, great. And how many are teaching classes online? Wow, good. That's great. I'd like to see that. So my job here today is to sort of give you a little bit of what I think might happen in the future, a little bit of what we're doing at ASU, some of the things that, I get, sort of concerned about for the future, some of the things that I think are working currently today, and what's the trajectory we need to go in. I'm a little bit of a weird fit because I'm a private sector person going into a university, and President Crow asked me to come in and say, run a research lab, and I'm like, well, I'm not really a researcher. I'm more of a private sector person and worked inside and outside of K-16 institutions for the last 20 years, but I'm really not an insider, and so I'm not really your best guy. And he said, well, we really are criticized heavily. He gets criticized heavily for investing a good portion of operating funds into online programs, and every time you turn around and make another announcement, a press will call him and say, does it work? Does online learning work? And so he said, I'm really, really getting tired, of all these questions, and there's really not good studies out there. Would you come in and just tell me if it works? And I said, well, if you want to research that, you can probably get a postdoc come in and, maybe run some regression or some other research methodology, and, other than descriptive statistics or something that's more, inferential, and that person will give you the answer. But if you wanted to look at research and look closely at the learning science of what happens inside a digital environment, and you take that research and actually turn it into real information that is a catalyst for change, and learning from that and then moving into sort of more of an R&D stage. I can kind of do that because I've built software. And he said, well, you know, why don't you want to be a researcher? And I said, you know, I'm just, you know, I don't have, you know, the background that other researchers do in this particular field. He goes, well, don't you want to know if any of the stuff you built works? Half the stuff we're using, you know, you probably developed or had a hand in developing. He goes, you know, don't you want to know if anything works? And I'm like, And I started thinking about it. So he set the hook. You know, he really set the hook as he has a habit of doing. So I entered about 3.5 years ago and started working, developing a lab, developing a data center, and getting the necessary resources up and running to make that happen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the current market condition today, talk about the type of demographics that we're facing, a very, very now the new norm, but formerly the differentiated learner that we've been serving in an online environment. I'll show you a little bit of the research we're doing, and I'm going to have to blow by that because it's very detailed, and I'm not sure I'm actually the best person to understand, you know, where the causality lies within the research methodology. I can talk about that if you're interested. New innovation experimentation, some of it we're doing at ASU, some of it I'm involved in past experiences, and then the notion of the data challenge that we've got. So to start, you know, this is a big market. Global expenditures to 2030 is about 10 trillion. Now this is global. This is mostly all education, both digital and non-digital education. So obviously, you know, a huge contributor to the economy. We're still very, very small percentage of the U.S. GDP, and we're a fraction, obviously, of healthcare, especially in research, but it's growing. If you look at the venture capital investment in billions, 8.2 billion through 2018. You can see it's been up and down a little bit. 2018 and 2019 has been a very significant year, and mostly these investments are in small, innovative companies, people getting anywhere between 5 million and 50 million. Unfortunately, many of them fail. The best organizations, the best innovators, for some reason, just can't cross the chasm because it's an extremely fragmented and competitive market. So some of the people that we see, that we come in and test technologies, and I'm sure you have the same experience, may not be around for the next year. So we'll talk a little bit in a minute about the chasm between private and public sector. It's something I'm very, very concerned about. But high failure rate in this particular area. If you look at global ed tech, a very, very significant increase in 2025 to 342 billion. And this is a global market. Obviously, it's U.S., but it's dominant Eastern and Western European, the Asian countries, and Australia. The challenge here is only 3% of that is still digital. It's still just digital globally. Now, we're a little bit different in the United States in terms of that percentage, but as a percentage of spend with traditional materials, it's still fairly low. In the US, we only have 12 companies that make up 80% of the ed tech spend. So 8 companies basically control the market, and we see it in vendor lock with LMS companies and with student information systems and organizations like that, where the cost of switching is very hard. The hype cycle, you've seen, I'm not sure if you've seen Gartner hype cycle. None of this would really surprise you. I think the AI part is on the upswing in terms of the innovation trigger. Next year, I would see that in the trough of disillusionment right here, because there is a significant amount of hype in this. Depends on how you determine and define what artificial intelligence is. There's a lot of focus right now on digital assessment. I'm working with both ACT and ETS and looking at how can we get out of the old modality of how we assess students and measure students. I'm going to talk about that a little bit down in the presentation. Competency-based education and adaptive, obviously, on the upswing. This can't happen, in my opinion, fast enough. The science isn't good today. Hopefully the science will advance in this. We'll chat a little bit about my early experience in doing research in this particular area. Now this is, you know, a story. Basically, there's no causal relationship between the student outcomes and the spend. I just did this to tell a story, but it does tell a story. Basically, you know, if you look at the green line, it's STEM, it's flat. It's NAEP, it's flat. Degrees awarded over represented populations and underrepresented populations, male and female, it's flat. And so, again, there isn't necessarily regression relationships between the two. These are merely statistics, one overlaid on the other, but it tells a story. We have not moved the needle in ed tech, and it's one of the challenges that we face moving forward. We're starting to see some progress in certain disciplines, but not certainly across the board. So this is the problem that we have today, is that we're very, and this is, you know, I'm probably one of the few guys who can speak about this because I've been on both sides of the equation, is you've got this chasm between the ed tech solutions supply market, everybody wants to sell you something, and then you've got the demand side uptake. And we're way out of balance here. You've got, you know, both sides are not in equilibrium. So on the supply side, we don't have a research-based approach. Shareholder value is more important, really, than sort of customer value. And the drive towards getting a liquidity event, you know, takes place over serving the customer the way they should be serving the customer. And on the demand side, the challenge here is non-consumption. You know, we buy a lot of things, but we don't use a lot of things, and we don't tend to get rid of a lot of things. We buy more things and we overlay them. So there's underutilization and a poor student success rate. So we've got to change the axis here. We've got to figure out new ways to be able to bring private sector in and to be able to co-create, really look at ways that we can establish relationships, foremost, that are research-based. And this is one of my big concerns here, that we need to make up a lot of ground over the next couple of years in developing the relationships that we need to develop with the right types of partners. I think it's really critical to move that needle that you saw flat, to be able to put the right people in the right room to create the right innovative solutions, but it's got to be co-created, you know, between the two parties. Okay, so we spend a lot of time looking at design. We talk a lot about design, and because the research that we do is specifically related to the people that sit in our group at EdPlus, which is kind of a nerve center for all digital education at ASU. We consolidate everything in one group. And we're joined at the hip from our research, and I'll show you some of the research, but we're joined at the hip with our instructional designers, because the output of the work that we do in research directly impacts the design. And so every single manuscript I've mandated among the research team that has two elements at the bottom of the manuscript, and it's actionability and intervention. We do a lot of research, but we don't really tie that to change. We don't tie that to new design imperatives. So we've got a huge, you know, changing demographic, and we've got to look specifically at design. So one of the ways we look at design, and this is sort of a composite diagram from ACT, and what are we designing for? Typically, what happens is we look at education from a siloed perspective. What happens in K-12? What happens in post-secondary? What happens in secondary education? And along this continuum from early education to workforce and these various different inflection points here between high school and post-secondary, where you've got these critical transitions, we need to look at education design as a continuum and not as a silo. And so as we begin to design throughout the process, when we talk about, President Crow talks a lot about this universal learner idea. The universal learner idea is not necessarily looking at educating a student in a particular silo, within a semester, within a course, within a year. It's looking specifically and holistically, looking at a whole student. So the way we like to look at this is, you know, you've got these distinct life stages. You've got, you know, the way we've looked at this in the past is, let's design something for the blue. Let's design something for the green. let's look at technical schools, let's look at workforce, and design for career tracks and career readiness. And when we really should be looking at it like this. And so this is a big design challenge. This is a big design challenge. And we'll talk about Gen Z, in a second in terms of the next generation of learner that's coming in. But this is one of the biggest things that we face every day. And the only way that we can change this is through the research that we do and really understand how to serve a really, really diverse population within ASU Online and other modalities based on the type of demographic, based on this learner continuum, and not necessarily a siloed approach. So Gen Z, so this is a big challenge. 24% of the population is Gen Z. We're going to be intaking these students very, very soon. 60% expect to have multiple careers by 30. I think the average was about 11, I think what the research says. They spend 41% of their time on mobile devices. The research basically says is they don't really know what a computer is. They don't even know what a laptop is or a tablet. They do 90% of their work in learning on mobile. We launched a digital high school for the state of Arizona, and working beyond Arizona too, 90% of what we designed for is going to be on a mobile device because that's what they know. They don't even know what a flip phone is. They only know smartphones. They use Venmo. Does anybody ever use Venmo? You guys? I don't understand. Your children, right. What I don't understand about Venmo is when you make a payment, you see everybody else. I know, but I don't want to know what somebody paid somebody else. I don't get it. So it's a payment solution social network. Okay, go figure. Photos versus Instagram. Their life is on Instagram, Uber, obviously, and the story I like to tell is my niece Olivia. When she was very, very little, she would go around, and my sister cannot drive correctly in terms of direction. She just does not have the directional sense of mind. So she had one of those, stick-up GPS things, right? And so my sister would always miss the street that she'd have to go on or make her left turn. And you remember it would say recalculating? So she grew up, she didn't call it a GPS, she grew up calling it a recalculator. She's like, hey, Mom, what's with the recalculator? But now she calls me up and she says, Uncle Lou, you know a lot about technology. What is it? What is that little thing on the upper left-hand corner of Microsoft Word or PowerPoint? You know what I'm talking about? It's the save button. It's a disk drive. It's a disk drive. Seriously? And she's like, what is that? And so she's calling me all the time, asking me these types of sort of questions, some of which I can't answer. Here's a good example. Do I get audio on this? So this guy's given the assignment in 4 minutes. Go figure out what this is. I edited this down, but the guys are looking up like, what, So it's like, this is what we're dealing with, and this is true. It happens all the time.
Well, the fact that we say we hang up the phone, like, what does that mean?
We hang up, yeah, exactly. Hang up the phone. Let's see if I can get this back on track here. Okay, so some of the things that we do here at the Action Lab is looking specifically at the 40,000 students on ASU Online, and then also looking at the other modalities, in particular adaptive learning. We haven't gone deep into fully adaptive programs versus sort of classroom-based, action-based sort of supplements using adaptive learning, as well as a MOOC-type adaptive tutor. So we look in those three modalities, and our goal is really to understand the behaviors of what happens in an online course. What do students actually do, why they do it, what's the causal effect of their behavior, and how the material is presented to them, how the course is constructed, how the faculty integrates and connects with students. So our job was really look at the cognitive social elements of how students learn in this environment, because there's not good science around it. There just isn't, and so we're really focused on that. We have about 7 researchers and an interesting technology group that I'll talk about in a second. So I'm going to burn through some of these slides because it is a little bit dense, but I'll burn through them anyway. So when I first got here about 2 years ago, my job was to say, let's go build a research team, and then on the other side, let's build a data environment, which is extremely hard. We've got, at that point, 30,000, now we're up to 40,000 students online with no data infrastructure. This is ASU, no data infrastructure. And so we started building this thing called the Learning Analytics Hub. And the first data pull from the first research report represented about 7 million course observations over 11 years, about 433,000 students, and 354 subject areas. So it's really, really dense, and we pared this down for different types of research purposes, looking both at the demographic and look at the learning analytics in terms how courses are constructed, how they're developed, and how students really relate to these courses in an online environment. So the first study that we did, we looked at ASU Online versus face-to-face, and we looked specifically at the demographic group, underrepresented populations, different gender, ethnicity traits, and we looked at the student success in terms of what they were doing and how those courses were constructed. And so I'll burn through some of these slides. So we did 3 dependent variables, completion, mastery, and DFW. And so this shows you a map of the entire landscape of ASU Online, what's working well, what's not working well. Basically, everything in red means that the face-to-face environment exceeds by a slight margin in the online space. And so, in this particular case, in this modality, completion, you can see that the communication course isn't doing as well as some of the other courses by far are as good as, if not better than the face-to-face. This is the passing modality. This is the mastery modality. And so you can see some change as you get into the higher level. Mastery means a B or above. Passing means anywhere between the DFW range and a C or a B. And so you can see how that changes. So the efficacy and equity metrics look at how well does an ASU course do overall relative to its matched face-to-face counterpart on a one-to-one basis, and how much does ASU owe in the face-to-face gap differ students in different attributes. And so we went through a variety of different things. You can take this data and look at the bottom side, female to male, on the left side in the x-axis or the y-axis, face-to-face versus ASU Online, and we can look. I don't think it animated. Let's see if it'll do it. So we can drill into the courses on the upper left-hand quadrant, which are those indicators on the upper left-hand quadrant, these here that are doing quite well, these here are not doing quite well. But we could go into that quadrant and look specifically at, what are the attributes of that particular course or those set of courses that work for this type of population, and how do we replicate that for the courses down below. Computer has a trouble with, here we go. So we look at ASU Online gap. In this particular case, it was 252 courses and 1 million course observations. And you can see across 3 separate modalities that there is a very, very small plus or minus standard deviation relationship between the two. Here it is by modality when we talk about face-to-face versus online. You can see, in the mastery it becomes, in the passing area it becomes much, much different. in terms of the population. This is STEM in particular. This is online gaps by discipline, so we can look at it by individual discipline. In this particular case, it's by gender and ethnicity and academic load. We look at this about how faculty relate to specific student attributes in the course. We look at this by the element of the course design, syllabus, discussion boards, exam, study tool, et cetera. And we can look at that across these three modalities and understand what changes need to take place in courses that aren't performing very well. This is a really, really important slide that I want to emphasize, is that all of the academic studies, all the research that's been done does not take these factors into consideration. And the most important thing is at the bottom, actually, every study, I don't know of one actually that that's different than what this says. Every study has not looked at online courses as a fully online experience for students. Every research paper that you've seen out there is a blended learning or a mixed modality learning environment. And so you sort of can't look at online versus face-to-face because you can see these points. As on-campus programs, there's an incredible amount of variability in terms of how they're developed and how they're supported. There's a lot of socio-demographic profiles that are very, very different. The on-campus education is not a viable option for a lot of students, so you automatically have a different set of population with different characteristics of it. And the scalable and affordable alternatives, traditional online, are necessary to meet the rapid increase. And so we're really trying to fill the need and fill the void through online education. And so we kind of give this face-to-face versus online a bad rap. We really look at it in ways that are not absolute. There is not a black and white situation based on those factors, and you rarely see this come out. So very, very important to consider that when you look at research effectiveness. So the diverse populations, in this particular case, you can see that face-to-face versus online, Pell eligible women, the density and the income age, it's misleading to compare online versus face-to-face outcomes because those populations differ very substantially. So it's really important to consider that. We've spent a lot of time looking at adaptive learning environments. And we've experimented about 60,000 students across 7 platforms for the last 6 years. And so we're looking at adaptable innovation. These are the vendors that we're working with. You probably know some of them. We're using these in an active learning environment, not fully either non-instructor-led or instructor-led through an entire course. This is used as an active learning environment, and we're getting really good results from the perspective of using it within that modality. One of the things that we're doing, which is interesting, and it's starting to work quite well, is this notion of open-scale courseware. So this is essentially how a global freshman academy with a project works or a course works with a technology, an adaptive technology, happens to be Alex in the back end. So what happens is student logs on, gets a knowledge check, a diagnostic, works through the course, works through the modality that they're working in each particular module. They're getting remediation feedback, automated. Everything in that dotted line is automated. Skill-oriented learning modules, learning resources, adaptive assessments, a variety of different resources that they're working through. They get a knowledge check. They get a meter on this one side. And then there is on the other side basically a human coaching team. And what's happening with a human coaching team is very, very different because when a student needs help, when they get to that sort of rotational module sequential learning path and they need help, it's not and I use the word picking up the phone, it's typically on a chat bot. The help and the faculty and faculty assistants helping the students are picking up the phone not saying, how can I help you? They're saying, I see you have a problem with differential equations. You have 3 assessments that you failed on this particular skill. Here's how I think I can help you. So automatically the ratio of students to coaches and mentors changes, but here's an example of a mixed modality where you've got adaptive learning and adaptive tutoring working in the back end with real humans helping in the front end. And I think this is, over the next 5 years, this is probably going to be the most effective method. This is an example of a semester course that is equations, statistics, algebra, rations, proportions, geometry, and number sequences. And basically what this represents is an entire semester, a sequential student activity going through. And you can see that it's very erratic, it's very chaotic, it happens quickly, slowly. Students are going back, getting re-skilled, they're going back and testing and assessments. Each one of those circles, as they fill up, means the student, individual student, is fulfilling its learning objective. But you can see, this is just an example of how it works in an adaptive environment as opposed to a standard LMS environment, which is very, very linear. So this gives us a good understanding of how students behave in an adaptive environment. And one of the things that we have to test the efficacy of actually how that works. How are we doing on time? How much? 25 minutes. Okay, good. Let's see here. So some of the things, I'll just burn through these as well. So we've tested adaptive math and adaptive calculus in these types of modalities in adaptive learning, and looking specifically at the incoming freshmen that have problems in the math and sciences, and then looking at a random controlled trial around what they're doing in a normal circumstance versus what they're doing in adaptive learning. And you can see in this particular case, the set of higher math ability students are going radically up, the same as lower math ability. So those students of higher ability, there's no difference between higher ability and lower ability. We think that this is helping. You look at shifts between C, D, F, and W to A and B. So we can see an increase in achievement when it comes to traditional instructive versus adaptive instruction. And this isn't just, these are not just descriptive statistics. This is projectable data. This is basically using regression and other methodologies that allow us to predict success in the future. So here's an example of underrepresented minorities, Pell-eligible women, other students. So across a gender gap, it doesn't make that much difference. When you look at how it represents across non-URM and URM, underrepresented minorities, again, it paces equally. This leads me to sort of say, okay, where are we today with the evolution of what our learning technologies are going through? So we're starting, years ago, 30 years ago, with static media, runtime applications that sit on your computer, video, DVDs, digital text, a variety of different other methods. And then learning management systems. The challenge with learning management systems are the demands are quite different, but we're sort of locked into the technology. It's very, very difficult to author. You have to understand how to be a SME and a teacher at the same time. It's still a one-size-fits-all environment. You've got 30 to 100 people students in a class, and they're all going through this at the same pace, learning the same material at the same time. So frankly, it's not that different than a textbook. And then you've got, not a great student experience. I think we're getting better in that. We've seen that in Canvas at ASU. And then you've got this notion of adaptive. And I've written a paper on this, but there's the evolution of adaptive where you're starting with these decision tree systems where we're at right now, right? So if you answer this right, you move on. Very, very one-dimensional, very banal. And then you'll move into a rules-based environment where there are pre-programmed rules for different types of learning circumstances and content. And then you move into advanced algorithm as the technology gets better, and then a true machine learning environment. The challenge is, what do we do now, right? I mean, we're all kind of stuck with the modality of learning management systems, but we've got the promise of adaptive, which is 5 to 10 years from now. So what do we do now? At ASU, what we've started to do is actually deconstruct the LMS, right? So we've experimented with about 50 to 60 technologies that allow us to essentially subordinate some of the features of a traditional LMS, like group discussion boards and wiki activities, et cetera, and bolting on different applications. And we can do that now because we have really, really good, sophisticated operability standards right now, both for content and LTI in terms of connections. And now we've got Caliber Analytics, Caliber events for data exchange. So it gives us the ability to really sort of rip it apart and rebuild it. That's the only way at ASU that we're actually accomplishing this, is to say, we're stuck with what we've got, we're experimenting with adaptive in certain areas, we can scale it where we can scale it, but by and large, we have to deconstruct the LMS. And so in the future, it's really all about, you know, AI. It's all about neural networks. It's all about learners. I'm not sure if anybody of you read the story about Google Translate, and it's pretty astonishing. Google's algorithm for Translate uses English as a baseline, where it's essentially translating from one language to the other. So it's in the background being extrapolated through English or some other language, baseline language. So if you're going from, you know, Japanese to Chinese, it's going through some baseline language. So after about 2 years, they found that, you know, nobody was really, the system was not hitting the intermediary language as much as it was before. And it turned out that the Google algorithm learned how, unto its own, to go direct from one language to another. And so that's what a learner is, that's what a neural network is. I'm not saying we're going to have that in education anytime soon, you know, but it is a real challenge. So we're going to try this thing. I hope it works. So who's going to bet that it works? Okay, let's give this a shot. Alexa, ask Pegasus, do you know where you're at?
Do I know where I'm at? Of course I do. I have location settings. Duh. Although I'm usually in the cloud, today I'm in Orlando, Florida at the Online Innovation Summit. I'm really hoping that someone will take me to Disney World when this is over.
Alexa, ask Pegasus to send an email to my differential equations professor.
Okay, what would you like to say in your email to Alexander Tufbis?
You ever see this professor online? He's the only professor that's got like a knight's helmet, you know, on. So I had to pick that guy, right? You know, so it was really great. Alexa, ask Pegasus what assignments are due this week.
You have a quiz due Thursday in CHM 1032, General Chemistry, and a group assignment due Friday in MAP 2302, Ordinary Differential Equations. Yikes! Do you want me to set up a reminder?
Alexa, ask Pegasus if you can get the answers for my calculus exam.
Lou, I'm smart, but not that smart. You might just have to do things the old-fashioned way and study for the exam.
Alexa, ask Pegasus what my balance is on my night card cash.
Let me look that up real quick. You have $12.21 left in your account. Would you like me to call your parents and ask for a refill? Cha-ching.
Alexa, ask Pegasus what jazz music events are happening on campus in March.
On March 22nd, there is an Orlando Jazz Festival Concert 1 at the Nicholson School of Communication, and Orlando Jazz Festival Concert 2 at the Nicholson School of Communication.
Anybody going to go to that? Alexa, why did Martin Luther condemn the Peasants' Revolt?
I'm not sure.
I'll ask it again. Alexa, why did Martin Luther condemn the Peasants' Revolt?
I don't know
Okay,
that.
It didn't work. It didn't work. So sometimes it works and some doesn't work. So basically, we're experimenting with this type of technology, and it's obviously not at the point where it's just going to answer the question because it knows to answer the question, like the Google translation scenario. But what we're doing is we are interconnecting this with a significant number of APIs to Gradebook, to an account that a student has, a debit card account, to a syllabus, to learning objectives for an individual course. So the system does have the ability to be able to scale across a university to connect to many different information sources. Now you have to force it, obviously, and write the script to have it connect, but it's very, very easy to connect it to those, and as long as you have written a script. So one of the things that we're trying to do with other universities, and maybe you guys are interested, is taking the standard script, then replicate that over a couple of universities, putting the answers in, and then over time working with Amazon to look at putting more AI into the system. So it's just a start, but I think we're in about 500 dorm rooms now, and it actually is being used on a regular basis, and it's actually not that much effort to put the answers to the questions in, as long as the API to the source material works. So that is just a fun little example of what we're doing. When I came to ASU, I was a little bit dismayed about how we do assessment, and I had worked at ETS and I'd worked in psychometrics before, and we really don't spend a lot of time on understanding the science and how we build assessments. And so one of the things that we're doing in some of our research is looking at not only cognition, but also looking at non-cognitive or social-emotional learning methods. And so we just launched a project with ACT where we've got 600 students taking a non-cognitive or social-emotional learning test, and we're looking at that as a predictor to cognition, a predictor to student success. So it gets into these cognitive, interpersonal, and intrapersonal skills. We're using what's called the Hexaco 6-dimensional model, which looks at these big 5 factors. And these are the things that students are testing on. We're matching that against student performance. We're looking at predictions and characteristics of different types of students around social-emotional measures. We initially used this assessment, which was really not appropriate for it, but we used it anyway just to get the method right. It was called Indigo. It's more of a I'm trying to think about what the characteristic is. It's like a disc profiles test, if you know that test. And so you can see on the X and Y axis all these individual traits that we narrowed down in a Pca analysis to look at, what are the key traits that actually work within this. And you can see the Pca analysis looks at these individual indicators and where they scored relatively high or low, and you can see the top 5 component names that came up within this individual test. So what does this mean? This means that individuality matters. The challenge we have is we test and assess students based on a norm-referenced model, or an IRT model, which is built by Frederick Lord back in 1956. And it basically measures you against everybody else. It doesn't necessarily measure what you know and how you learn and how you can apply. It measures you against everybody else. And so that, we're developing interventions about you compared to everybody else. And in the healthcare space, if I've got melanoma, I don't necessarily want to be treated like everybody else, right? If I had a rare disease, I don't want to be treated like everybody else. And so we've got a lot of movement to do in this particular area, and this is where adaptive actually falls down. So the adaptive logic models are built on item response theory and old measures of normed reference. And so is the diagnostic right? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Are we advancing students through an adaptive environment in the right ways? Maybe yes, maybe no. So we've got to really look at this very, very carefully. I would encourage everybody to get this book. It's called The End of Average. And Todd Rose says that it's unacceptable that at an age that we can map the human genome, we can't map human potential. And so on an individual to individual basis. So this is really important. And when we look at 100 different nervous systems in a classroom, but one size fits all in the assessment, in the content, in the course. So these are things that are really, really important to look at in the future. And so when you think about everybody in this room, if we neuro-imaged everybody's brain, would it look the same? Probably not, okay? And so these are the kinds of things that we're really interested in, trying to advance into more precision around assessment systems. So a couple things we're doing with data. One of the things that when I came in, not surprising, I came into a university, and what happens is when you start a new initiative, what happens with the new initiative is you retrofit the strategic initiative to the existing structure. And I just, from the private sector, hadn't been using. You reshape the organization about the goal, and it's very hard to do at a university. So what we did was we created a joint venture between our UTO as our central IT group, and we co-located 7 programmers, 2 business intelligence specialists, and 5 data analysts within our group. And so we've got 7 researchers, associate researchers, along with our data team that sit in one place. And so we just changed the organizational structure. We didn't change reporting. It didn't matter who reported to who. We just put the right bodies in the right room. And I think this really, really accelerated the ability to access data and to have data in service to the research, but also have data available, learning analytics available to lots of other instructors and faculty. Many of them have gotten grants just based on the data that they were able to get. So this is an organizational change that's happened. So there's sort of 3 things. This is very low level, and this is all built on around 60 coaches. At ASU Online, everybody gets a coach. So within that coaching environment, we set up dashboards so each one of those coaches can have a better examination on an individual-to-individual basis of each student that they're coaching. So there's pull data, what are we getting from students? There's push data, what are we pushing back to students? What are we pushing back to all of the others, the coaches, and then how are we zooming in and drilling in? So there's pull data. I don't know if how much time we have? 10 minutes, okay, good. So there's pull data with a student activity dashboard. I probably won't launch this one. There's push data around course activity. Well, pull data is really about an overview of a student's current course load and understanding how they're faring against everybody else, and some of the determining factors of where they're ahead and where they're behind. Let's see if I can launch this. Interesting. Well, this is actually a good thing because they're restricting me on someone else's PC to not get the data. So, here's a good example of, individual students, and you can see from a coach's perspective how Ann Howard is faring. You can go through, individual students, and you can, look at individual students' achievement rates on every individual course, whether they're below the average and below the set cut line that the faculty wants to see. And you can actually go into, looking at the specific behavior of the student within the course, how much time they've spent in course, how much time they've accessed materials, et cetera. So that's one example. Here's another example. I'll run through this, really quickly in terms of another type of dashboard. Yeah, okay, so this is student performance versus time in class. And what we're doing with this is we're looking at this data specifically. You can see on the right-hand side much more frequency, and we can map this against what they're doing in terms of academic achievement in the course, whether they're below the line or above the line. And this data happens in real time. And here's another good example of specifically looking at how students are either coming into, oops, not the right one actually, how students are actually coming into a course and not, is it the right, let's see here. I think this is what I want to do. Yeah, this is, I duplicated the URLs, but you get the point. I mean, this gives you a lot of information from a coaching perspective. It's made it much more efficient, and it's not a closed-looped environment right now. Coaches are receiving the information. They're giving remediation and support to students based on data. Now what we need to do is close that loop and understand the activity of the coach and whether the coach is actually having an impact. In this particular case, what I was trying to show was how students are opting out within an environment. So in the upper left-hand quadrant, which you can't see, you've got incredibly high-achieving students that are just dropping out. They're withdrawing. And so they've accessed all the materials, they've worked with their faculty, they've talked to their faculty, and all of a sudden they drop out. Well, what's the reason for that? The reason, did something happen? Was there a crisis? Did somebody die? Are they sick? And so these are the kind of things we need to take into consideration. The interesting thing about these types of things is when it's really interesting about the nuance on how a coach engages with a student. And this is what data can do. So we've learned a lot about that behavior. A coach says, I see that you're not doing well, versus tell me about your week. Tell me about what's happening in your academic environment. And so we've learned a lot based on data on how to engage with a student, what dialogue to use, what to ask them, how to ask them, and what frequency. And so we're learning, a lot about that. I'll burn through a couple of these. These are just basically archetypes. So we look at the entire ASU Online course, and we're looking at, individual feature type. We can use this as a focus, as a baseline for some of the research. And so you can see, how the archetypes go across. You're talking about breaking this up in terms of how each courses are breaking up according to feature, modules, course counts by type, good use assessment, heavy letter use, course counts in cluster modality, a variety of different things. This is a case where we're looking at course cluster over time. So this gives us the ability to say, okay, we've got empirical research on our side, but this is a baseline that would allow us to just concentrate our research on those courses that have these types of characteristics. Other than that, we're just fishing. So this gives us a baseline in terms of what we're doing. So I'm going to finish off here. And I think, we as an industry, we have to set the past on fire. We can't define the future by what we know and have learned today over the past 20 or 30 years. So we've got to really innovate. And I was talking to President Crow the other day, and we were talking about how we're taking our online environment and trying to reach underrepresented populations in different types of the world in social impact, abject poverty nations as well as third world developing nations. And there's a lot of passion. There's a ton of passion. And I said to President Crow, I said, don't ever confuse passion with urgency. With urgency comes execution. So we have to figure out how to create the execution that's needed. Forget about the past, create the execution and the future that you need. So the burn list, in my opinion, is let's not operate from the perspective of fear around data. Let's operate from the perspective of transparency. Let's move away from a one-size-fits-all environment. Let's break down the vendor lock and try to experiment and deconstruct. Let's look beyond just the one-dimensional learner. Let's not use just norm reference environments. Let's look at social emotional impact and how that's a predictor of success. Let's move around and experiment with non-traditional design, and then just risk. I mean, this is one of the things that President Crow's allowed us to do is just experiment, just risk and experiment. Take on the risk that you want. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you for me being your first meeting, and I hope you learned something today and were inspired.
I think we have time for one or two questions from the audience. Any burning questions? Here we go.
Thank you. I don't have a question so much as an observation. I've done a lot of research with online learning. I owned a software company before, produced a lot of educational materials. And one thing I've noticed, and it's not a criticism, I've noticed this broadly speaking, but Jerome Bruner wrote a book called The Process of Education. And his main thesis was students won't learn well unless they're ready to learn. What I've observed over and over in technology classes is that students are not ready to use the technology, and I think that's something that people generally don't pay attention to. I'd like your response to that.
You automatically think that they're tech ready, and they may not be. Any other questions?
Okay, one more.
Hi, I was just wondering if you care to share your thoughts about some of the, you mentioned before how instructional designers are core to your team, and I've been, following some of the developments in the past few years, like the academic innovation labs and the this idea about thinking about learning engineers instead of designers, and there's now a conference coming up sponsored by iCycle. I just wanted to see if you could share your thoughts about that evolution of the role of instructional designers into learning engineers and how it plays into this.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great observation. I think our challenge is that historically, instructional designers did not have the permission or the cachet or the information to be able to transform their roles into engineers, right? Because they're always working in one modality. They didn't have any information. They were doing what the faculty wanted them to do. And I think over time, they've established this relationship with faculty where there's a lot of trust, and they give back to these, essentially instructional designers. Now, over time, with that trust and over time with the research, I think we're now just starting to get into an environment where with the research that we're collaborating with on the instructional design team, they're saying, oh, well, peer-to-peer is really important in this, and we know from your research that peer-to-peer, peer-to-faculty is really, really important. So let's pull this tool down, bolt it on to our learning management system, and run a series of random control trials on how that works. And so, I'm really impatient. I'm really, really an impatient person. And it's taken 3 years to get the research right, where we're now just starting to do that. We're now having, different, we break them up into disciplines. So certain disciplines are actually trying different types of instructional design with either embedded tools that they didn't use or putting other tools on top. They're doing a lot of work now with new assessments and bolting on assessment tools. And that gives them kind of the permission to be able to do it, but it's a great observation. And I think one of the drivers behind achieving that state is consolidation, because they're working together as a team, but they're also working together as faculty members. I'm a big believer in the consolidation on instructional designers.
Thank you, Lou. You've given us so much to think about today. We have a small token of our appreciation for you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. This is like very complicated.